last session for just a minute before we move to the next one, okay? Moxon asked a really good question, and the question was, if we're the helpers, what does this mean, right? In other words, we've talked about this where the soil is my heart, right? And so I have to take in the ideas. I have to do something different in terms of the everyday rhythm of what I do with my body. I have to interact with others differently. But if I now step back and I say, okay, I'm somebody's friend, and I'm here to help them go through a transformation process, what does this mean now as far as helping another person? Okay? There's two things to say. First, the greatest help I can give another person is to do this in my life. That's the first thing. Okay? For me to take in, to grasp, to practice, to relate based on the gospel is the single greatest help I can give to anybody else. Okay? Second, as I want to help them, you can kind of think of what the helping role is in each of these cases. If it's the ideas that are unclear, what's needed is some kind of explanation, right? Just helping put a big enough picture together where they can see how this fits, okay? And so it's just aiming at clarity. And let me be clear. Our task is just that. It's clarity. It really is not persuasion. Okay? Persuasion is the Spirit's job. Okay? Our job is to be clear, and that gives the person the opportunity to think through it, to decide, so forth. It is not for us to pressure or anything else. It's for us to bring the clarity for the idea. And the reason is that where is the power in this? It's already there. It's inside the seed. The seed is a power to make a new life form. I don't need to add power to the seed. All I need to do is help it land, and we do that with clarity. Okay? So if I'm helping, I explain, and my aim is clarity, not to get them to do something. It's just clarity. Okay? Now, if as it were, the roadblock, the breakdown in the transformation process for the person are the disciplines, the bodily practices, it may be that some explanation is needed, but a large part of what's needed is modeling, helping them see what it looks like to do this. Okay? And so, if it's prayer, if it's, how to help another person in a way that's not conspicuous. And so, like, just having somebody next to you as you do this in your own life, right? That can be helpful for that person. Okay, so it kind of moves to modeling. If the problem is the social relations, okay, that this person is one way, in the family, a different way with his buddies, different still, like third persona at work, something else at church, something else in the gym. If there's not a unified identity that this person has, no matter where he's at, then what's needed is something like coaching. Okay, you think about what a coach does. The coach works with the players when it's not game time, right? And he drills. He says, okay, I notice that something happens when this happens on the field. You move this way instead of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to drill, go in the right direction. And so we'll do a little bit of practice. But then when it's game time, where's the coach? He's on the sideline. Okay? He's watching because he can see some things that the player doesn't. But he can't play the game for him. These are the sorts of things everybody has to do for themselves. Okay? So, but what you can do is kind of coach. Right? So as far as the helping role, that's kind of, you can kind of back out it there. But again, the single greatest help you can give somebody else is to go through this transformation process yourself. Okay? All right. Let's move now to the focus of the second session. And in your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 12. So this first account that we have, where we started, is really focused on what's happening at the level of our attention. Okay, that kind of focal point that is our heart in biblical terms. But there's more to a person than those moments of focus. Okay, in fact, all told, our moments of focus are a rather small bit of our life. Okay? It's rather small. Now it's vital, it's important, and that's where the change begins, and that's why he focuses on that. Jesus does in the parable of the soils. He focuses on the heart, on the attention. But we're going to have to find a way for the change to get down to the places where we're not focused. Okay? For it to really, really change us. And so, let's go to Mark chapter 12. And if I could have a volunteer read here in just a moment, verses 28 through 34. What's going on in this passage is that Jesus is approached by a scribe. Okay? So, this is the intellectual class of his day. He's the guy who reads and writes when most people can't. And the scribe asked Jesus, of all of God's life instructions, all the commandments, what's first? Okay? And Jesus gives a sequence. He quotes from Deuteronomy 6, but he actually modifies the passage. And in this quotation, he tells us something about the basic elements within the human self. Okay? What goes into a full human being, and how can these things be changed so as to come in line with love of God? Okay, and so let's start by reading the passage, and just ask you, when you hear it the first time, just think of what are the basic parts of the self. Okay, and you can think of this if this is about how Jesus remakes a person. If you're going to remake something, and you're kind of like an artist working on something, you got to know your materials. Okay, so we'll just start with what are the basic materials within a human person. Okay, so if I can have a volunteer read it nice and loud for all of us. Okay.
One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked them, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Well said, teacher, the man replied. You are right in saying that God is one, and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said to him, You are not far from the kingdom of God. And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions.
Okay, thank you. So, Jesus says, right, or he quotes here from Deuteronomy with a little change, that the primary thing that we're on about here is coming to love God in this kind of order. And so let's just lay out what we have here. The first one is what? It's the part that we've been talking about, right? So first is the heart. And let me just I'll say this, and we'll come back to make a little bit more of a point out of it. The word that gets translated as most important is actually the word first. Okay, like first, second, third, fourth, right? And so there's an order, there's a sequence that's going on here. And I'm just going to suggest this, that part of what's going to go on as we get to understand the significance of this is that Jesus is addressing a sequence of change within the person. So this is not just random. The order is important. Okay, so it starts with clarity about who God is. Okay, about this one God. Okay, and then that produces a change in these levels of the self. And so the first level is the heart, and that's where we started. And so we know that that's attention. It's about our focus, right? But what comes next?
Soul.
The soul. Okay, and then what is it?
Discursive thoughts.
Yeah. What you'll have in your translation will probably just be mind. Okay. The term it's pronounced a little bit different today. So now it's Diania. It was Diania in the old Greek. The accent has moved. But part of what you need to know when you're reading through the New Testament or anything in Old Greek is that Greeks describing mental functions, like the ancient Greeks talking about mind, or like Eskimos talking about snow, right? So if you talk to an Eskimo, I'm told, because I don't speak Eskimo, but that they have like 20, 30 different words for what in English is just snow, right? Why? Because they live in an environment and have, for generations in which the minute variations matter. Because it makes different things happen. And so they have words, they have tags for the different types that we just call snow, okay? In English, we have the word mind, but there's a lot of different words in Old Greek that we translate that way, and they have different meanings, okay? The word, this one, I'll give it to you here as discursive thought, okay? Discursive thought, or something like self-thought. Am I spelling that wrong, Jackson?
No, that's right.
It's okay? All right, thank you. You see, I've been waiting for a whiteboard with spell check, and God sent me Jackson instead. That's awesome. Okay, so we'll come back to that, but it's a particular kind of cognitive function, okay? From there it goes to what? Strength, okay? And yeah, here, I'm going to put strength over here and I'll add another word to it here. I'm going to say, I think this is talking about what we would call bodily strength, okay? The things we do out in the world through our body that affect it, that change it. Okay? And that leads then to the second, which is like it, and that is you love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? So these are, I'll just put neighbor relations. Neighbor or social relations. And we really should think about this as a part of the self. Okay? Because as it turns out, there is no such thing as a human person. It's not even possible to become a human person without social relations. Okay? If a little baby comes out and is never bonded to, loved, taken care of, related to, it just dies. Okay? And so there's no possibility of a human life without neighbor relations. Okay? So now what's happening in this passage then is that when Jesus is asked about the sequence, okay, what's most important to happen, the idea behind that is that that you could, if you really understood how God's instructions fit together as a whole, if you could find the first, the first one would become the foundation from which you would understand, and the second one would follow. And the third would follow from the second, and the fourth from the third, and so forth. That they imply each other. Okay? And this was not an uncommon question in the world of Jesus' day. And he addresses similar questions in other places when he talks about, for instance, the priest in the temple breaking the Sabbath and yet being guiltless. Why? The idea is that what the priest is doing is first, or it's deeper than the prohibition on working for the Sabbath. And so even though they're working on the Sabbath, it's not breaking the Sabbath because they've gone to a deeper level. Okay? So that's the kind of question he's being asked, is like, what's the deepest level of God's instruction, right, that we need to live out of, that the rest would follow from? Okay? And his response is, well, we got to put the first on top here. Okay? It starts with God. It's love of God. And so, and it's actually the identity of this particular God, right, that is the first and most important element of all change. Now, we're going to give that its own session, okay? And so we're going to talk about the Father's name, this matchless name, and give it a whole session. So we're going to come back to that. But what we want to do is follow it through. That's the foundation from which this change takes place, where we learn to love God in this sequence, okay? So, and I think the way to understand this is that we start by loving God in a way that we focused and we pay attention to it and we make an active choice. That's this heart level. Okay? But if we have as our strategy for loving God that we will just choose every minute, moment by moment, we will keep choosing to love Him, then we will fail. Inevitably. Inevitably, we will fail. And here's why. Okay? This capacity we have for focus, for kind of zooming out, bringing things within the frame, making a choice, it's incredibly powerful. It's the basis, it's the beginning of any real change in a human life, but it's also incredibly fragile and short-lived and ultimately limited. It's limited. And the reason is that it takes energy. Okay? Now you already know this, right? I mean, you've had those experiences of a long day, you've been focusing, you've been doing all you can, you're hungry, you're tired, and then that one little, it's small when your kid does it, right? That ordinarily you would laugh at or be tickled by, but all of a sudden what happens? You know, it's like a volcano erupting and you're angry or whatever, right? Why? Like, it's because you reached the end of where you could be rational, where you could make choices, right? And this is, it's just throughout human life, the limited nature of our capacity to focus, to pay attention, to choose, is a reality that we have to come to terms with. Now, marketers and people selling things know this also, and that's why when you go through a grocery store, like the big supermarket ones, not the little family ones, because they're not diabolical enough to figure this out, but like the really big chains, what they do is they put all of like the healthy choices as you go through the store early, and then when you're worn out by having to choose, right? You've gone through the whole store and you're there at the checkout line. What do they put right next to the
Candy.
all the candies and stuff? Why? Because you've used up your willpower.
Yes.
Like literally. You have burned your energy for making good choices. And so there at the last second, just before you pay, there's this something else. It's like pop. And next thing you know, like, how did I end up with this Snickers? Right? And it's just because the heart only has so much energy to work off of. And so if our strategy for transformation, right, for coming to love God is to just choose it over and over and over and over again, what that will mean is our life will be full of failures. There'll be moments where we get it, right? But there'll be a lot more where we're just too worn out. Okay? So what is the wise strategy for coming to do what is good for God? Okay? A wise strategy for a life of loving God is that we receive the message here and we make that choice, but then we take what energy we have for making decisions and we use that choice to start working on a deeper layer, on this layer that is called soul. Now, what is the soul? I think today it's difficult for people to make sense of this because it's kind of like, because we don't use the language in the same way that it was used in biblical days, okay? And so if I were to ask you, how is your pancreas feeling? Okay, I think most people, unless you've had pancreatitis and been able to connect the feeling with the diagnosis, like most people, like they don't know the words, like pancreas. I don't know where to start. Like, right? I don't know how to answer that. I think it's the same thing if you ask somebody, how's your soul? How's your soul doing? And I think most people would be like, I don't know, dude. I don't know how to identify it in my experience, right? And so one of the most important things for us in this process of transformation is finding an entry point in our experience to know when we're talking about heart, soul, discursive thought, on down. Okay? So what I want us to do here for a few minutes is talk about what's a soul. Okay? And so in Hebrew, nephesh, in English, in Greek, psyche, this term, soul, describes the life force of a body. We'll start there. It's the life force of a body, an organic body. Okay? Now, when I say it's the life force of a body, I didn't say a human body. Okay? Because it turns out that soul is the life force of all sorts of living bodies, beginning in biblical thought as far down the chain of being as fish. So you go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, and God creates first in this living soul within the sea, fish and sea monsters and things like this, right? And so fish have soul, right? Your puppy dog, your cat has soul. You go all the way up to great apes, and they got soul, okay? And even Phil has soul, okay? So, like, from all the way up, right? From the little critters up to us, there's something that kind of connects us in terms of the kind of life force of our bodies. Now, when you read through Scripture, it's also clear that there's a certain amount of kind of cognitive experience, right? There's experience of soul as well. But if you're gonna kind of put your finger on the experience, you have to start by remembering that it's the sort of thing that your dog can have too. Okay? So it probably doesn't have a lot to do with like literature and probably, calculus and, programming your computer and all of that. You're going to have to go deeper and lower than that. Start here. Okay? I want to see if I can just evoke an element of your experience that is a soul experience. Okay? Start with daydreaming. Or that experience of kind of coming out of sleep, going in, that kind of in-between zone. Some of you are there right now, okay, I can tell. But if you attend to that, part of what you will notice is some strange features. Okay? The first thing is that there's this kind of flow in the experience, and I'm going to use that word flow a lot when I talk about soul. And I don't think it's just a metaphor, because actually in biblical terms, soul is always liquid. Okay? It's located in your blood, but you pour it out, it leaks out, it overflows, or it dries up. But it's always liquid. In scriptural terms. Yeah. And so, but there's, at that level, if you think about this kind of dream experience, things happen and there's a sequence, but there's not really time, right? It's just one thing kind of flows into another. And it's also not really clear, there's not a clear distinction between what's in here and what's out there, what's me and what's in the exterior world. Okay? Let me give you some example of that. So you've had the experience of your alarm going off in the morning, right? You're asleep, and that sound of the alarm getting incorporated into your dream, right? You're still asleep, but this alarm sound starts becoming part of the dream inside. You don't experience it as out there, it's still in here. Okay? Now, objectively, we can step out and we say, well, something out here is causing it. But for the soul, at this level of experience, there's no inside-outside. There just is what's there. Okay? There's no inside-outside. There's no me versus it. It's all this one experience that I'm having. Okay? The second thing is, when I say there's not time, you can go back to that same experience of that alarm clock. Okay? You've had the experience where it brings you out enough, you snooze, right? Now your snooze button is only 10 minutes long. You go back to sleep, and you've had the experience of having a very long and involved dream, where it feels like time is like there's a lot that's happened, and then it goes off again. Now you know somehow, in terms of clock time, out there, that all was 10 minutes. But inside the soul, at that level, there's no way you could time it like that. Like the soul has a kind of duration of its own that is not something you can count on clocks, right? And so there's this level. Now that is a beginning of a set of experiences of this kind of life flow in us that we actually share with animals. Okay? Now, within that, then, there's a lot that happens that's just kind of automatic. And, well, let me give you one other place where you can think of it. Now that you've had this experience with like dreaming or daydreaming, come back to those moments when you're focusing on something. And you'll notice that underlying level of experience, that flow, is still there. Okay? But it's there in a very particular way. It's what you're pushing to the side in order to pay attention. Okay? So if you're reading a book, or you're having a conversation with somebody and you really want to get what they're saying, okay? And so you're focusing, so that's your heart, right? Your heart is focusing in. In order to focus, you have to not think about a bunch of other stuff, right? You have to hold it to the side. That soul is what you're holding to the side in order to focus. Okay? And so I'm reading a book. And sometimes that flow, that underlying stuff, what's in the basement, so to speak, right? There's too much there. It's pushing in too hard. And I find it very difficult to focus. Right? I keep getting distracted. I lose what I'm reading about. Right? Because what's there is all that, it's the bill I forgot to pay. The e-bill I didn't process at lunch, and now I have to remember to come back to it. It's the background sadness at the loss of a friend, right? It's just kind of there and it hurts, right? It's all of these other things that that are part of this underlying flow. It's in our nervous system, so to speak, and it never goes away. It can only be kind of held for a while at a distance, okay? Now, at that same level are things like automatic responses, reflexes, habits, okay? Part of what habit is, let me just tell you this in biblical terms. Habit is when something has moved from your heart, you started it by choosing it, and it now has become a part of your soul. Okay? It's now part of that automatic flow within just the life force in your body. Okay? And so when your tummy rumbles and you're already digging in the, in the freezer for ice cream, or alternately, stirring up a protein shake or doing something else, right? Whatever it is, when you're doing that before you think about it, it's at the level of soul. Okay? Now, so this is what soul is. Now, what's a soul good for? Why do we have this? It's because of the limitations of our heart. We cannot live if we have to choose all the time everything that we do. Right? And that's why God's so wise. He puts, for the most part, our breathing happens here. And our heart pumps. And all of that soul stuff. And He gives us, we can engage our heart and change our breathing. But it's hard to keep it for too long. Right? And so, He puts stuff at the level of soul that we would die when we ran out of the capacity to choose it. Right? If it's that, essentially puts it at the level of soul. Okay? Now, part of what happens there is the soul then, it changes over time. It picks up from what we do over and over and over again. Whatever we repeat, it becomes adapted to at the level of soul. And the soul, that flow, okay, it moves in the direction of what's repeated over and over and over again. Okay? And you can just think about this, something like, footsteps in the snow, right? Clean snow, one set, you walk once and it may snow over again. But you walk it 5 times, 10 times, 100 times, now there's a path, right? And you see the difference. And that's, or follow the liquid metaphor, right? What does a stream do over time? It carves down into the ground, okay? And so that's what soul does. Like what we do over and over and over again, it gets into the soul, and the direction of soul has a kind of momentum to it. And that's part of why it's hard to change, right? That's part of why it's hard to change. But when it is changed, it's why it's so transformative, so powerful. Because if the soul is changed, then what we do when we can't think is different. And that is the goal, to be clear. The goal of transformation in Jesus' way is to use our capacity to choose in order to put in habits, a way of doing things that are God-honoring, even when we can't choose anymore. Okay? Now, so this is that second level. Okay? It's the level of habit and all of that, the soul. Now, if we use our capacity to choose to engage in spiritual disciplines, okay, in bodily practices and such that change the soul level, over time, that will give rise to this other level. And this, by the way, this is the one that Jesus inserts. It's not there in Deuteronomy 6. Jesus adds this. Okay, the anya. Okay? Now, why do we have why does he add discursive thought? What's this talking about? So we said there's lots of different forms of mind. This is one talking about discursive thought. Okay? Let me add a little bit to that. So you have this experience of images and all of that at the level of soul, but you also have this other experience that kind of, as it were, there in soul, or, bubbling up out of the soul, is this kind of voice. There's this kind of talk that goes on in the back of our mind. And it sells things like this, right? So that's exactly what mine sounds like. What happens at this level, what Jesus says is we take our capacity to choose, we use that to engage in certain practices. So for instance, if what gets inscribed now at the level of my soul, the kind of disciplines I take on are things like memorization and meditation upon Scripture. Songs. Songs have a way of getting into that level. Okay? And this is wonderful and this is awful, depending on what the song is. Like when we were... So our kids watched this little Disney thing, Frozen. Anybody had kids of that generation? Yeah. So there's this song, Let It Go, right? Yeah. Oh. It stuck inside of the mind, and it became this thing that you could not get rid of. And it was oppressive, right? Eventually. It started off like it was kind of like this beautiful moment in this, but it was oppressive because you could not get the thing out of the back of your mind, right? And so there's this kind of feature, this running commentary, little talk, stuff that's always going on in the back of the mind. And what Jesus here describes is that once we've rerouted soul through these kind of disciplines, and we're going to talk about some of those later, part of what happens is the content of soul changes. That changes what kind of words get kicked up in the back of our mind when we're not even choosing them. Okay? Just what is it that's popping up when I'm doing the dishes or walking down the street, and there's all the kind of beings we are, there's words coming out, but they can change over time. Okay? But the sequence is important. Now, what happens when this self-talk level, the self-talk, is brought in line with always moving towards what's good for God, love of God? That changes what we can do in our bodies. Okay? It changes the kind of actions that we will naturally choose and undertake. Really, the most essential element for any action is having the notion to do it. It's just occurring to you. Right? The reason that so many things don't happen is it just doesn't occur. It never crossed my mind to try that. Right? And the fact of the matter is, I can't do anything if it never crosses my mind to do it. Right? That's the first step in any action. It occurring to me to do it. Now, what happens is when that self-talk is brought in line with love of God. Okay? And so what bubbles up in the back of our mind has to do with, His goodness and the wonder of what He's doing in the world around us. What occurs to us to do is different. And all of a sudden, it just kind of, maybe for the first time, I think of reaching out to that person. Can I pray for you? Helping in a way that doesn't draw attention. Just little things it just occurs to us to do now. Right? And so our bodily strength, our bodily actions change, and we're able to bring those now in line with what's good for God and God's project. And as that happens, we find we now have the capacity, having loved God with all of the layers of ourself, to love the guy next door. And maybe we can even do what's good for that guy when he's yelling at us. Maybe even when he's yelling at us and we don't know what he's saying. Okay? And so this is the sequence that Jesus lays out for the transformation process. Okay. Now, how important is it for this to take place in this order, in this way? It's interesting. There's, I think, a tendency that we have to try to do this. Try to just kind of skip over. It's very common, I think, in Christian circles to put a lot of focus on this. We want people to make a decision, and then we want them to go do things. Okay? And so we have a lot of 1, 4, 5. It's like, wait, say that again? 1, 4, 5. Something's missing. What's missing there? We have this tendency to try to skip this element of the transformation of the underlying stuff within us. And it's interesting, it's not just 21st century as a problem. And here in the text, Jesus is interacting with a guy who has the same issue. Okay? The scribe, it says, he answers, and now I want you to notice what he does. He tries to kind of repeat this back, but he intellectualizes it. Okay? He makes it, first of all, he makes it more abstract in the language. So Jesus and Deuteronomy, it's love the Lord your God, right, with all your heart, your soul, right, so forth, right? It's personal. When the scribe repeats it back, what does he say? To love with all the heart. To love, right? And so it becomes abstract. So but there's a deeper thing, and that is that the scribe, he collapses 2 and 3, and he turns it into synesis, okay? Which a good way you could translate that is something like erudition. Okay, it means to connect things. It's a cognitive activity of trying to make connections. It's the sort of thing that happens when you cross-reference in your Bible. You say, oh, this verse is like that verse. And so when he does this, okay, so verse 32, the scribe says, well said, teacher, truly you have said that he's one, there's no other beside him, to love him with all the heart and all of the, this gets translated probably understanding, right? It's intellectualized, right? And all the strength, and to love one neighbor as oneself is greater than all burnt sacrifices, burnt offerings and sacrifices. And then notice here in verse 34, Jesus notices this. Jesus, seeing that he had answered in the adverb here is nunechos. It comes from nous, which is another one of these Greek words for mind, but it has to do with like intellectual insight, okay? Jesus says, so it gets translated most wisely, but let me give you another translation for this, that he answered intellectually. Jesus, he sees that the scribe is a little bit stuck between his ears. He's not dealing with his whole self. He's just wanting to work at the level of kind of attentive choices and mental understandings. He answers intellectually. Notice what Jesus says. Jesus is gentle. He's a loving guy. He's as complimentary as it is possible for him to be, but he notices something's a little off. And so what he offers is, well, in English we would say it's a left-handed compliment. Okay? He says, noticing, Jesus, he sees that he answers intellectually. He says, you're not far away from co-working with God, from the kingdom of God. Okay? In other words, he says, you're moving in that direction, but you're still going to find yourself a little shy of being able to really co-work with God. You're not far away, but you're also not there. Why? Because if you're going to get there, the 1, 4, 5 doesn't work. You're going to have to move through 2 and 3. Okay? In order to really be changed, to work with God on an ongoing way, we have to deal with this stuff. That the part of me that has to be trained a little bit more like I would train my dog, right? And this part, have you ever tried getting a dog to do a trick by quoting a verse? It doesn't seem to respond well to that. It's just like it missed, you know? And the thing is that there's elements of ourself. There's elements of ourself that just don't respond to that intellectual level. Now, we have to start there, but if we don't reroute it into things that we drill with our body, that become habit, so that they can happen when we can't choose, when we're not thinking, then it stops the full transformation process. Okay? And so intellectualism is actually one of these pitfalls for the full transformation process. Okay? All right. Stop there. Questions, comments? Yeah.
Where do you see the role of emotion in all of this?
Yeah, that's good. So the thing is that emotion is here. Because it really overlaps all of this. Emotion, I think, is not so much a part of the self as it is an aspect or a moment, an angle. And so, like in my conscious focus, there's always an emotive charge to any thought. It's impossible to think about anything without feeling something, right? Whether it's, as it were, an intense feeling or soft, you know, all of that, right? It changes. So it's there in my conscious thought, but it's also there in my underlying, right? And so there's a lot of emotion that is at this deeper level. And what we talk about as mood really is more soul, right? Because it's not the chosen thing, it's what's there that I can't keep out, right? And so emotion sinks down into all these levels. And it even, the reason I brought it all the way down here, and maybe I should put it through to neighbor as well, but I should actually, now that I say that. But it changes our bodily posture and everything else. So emotion, it goes into our actions, how we hold our bodies, and it certainly changes. So emotion kind of runs across all of this. It's an aspect of all of it. Yeah.
I wonder if that's part of what the scribe is missing. That he's connecting it here, but he's not connecting it.
That's entirely possible. That might be one of the reasons why a person would want to avoid this level. Right? Sometimes what's in the basement is too scary to look at. And so what we do is when we get a little feel of something going on down here, we look back and let's have another study. Right? And so we can do that as a way of avoiding dealing with that layer. Yeah.